So now we are okay. Good morning to everyone. I want to thank Hiro Ito and Robert McCauley for accepting our invitation and sharing the results on the research on the composition of the foreign exchange research with us. We also thank this webinar's participant attendance, particularly all the central bank's officials who supplied information that was very useful input for this research project. Both Hiro Ito and Robert had a vast background of studying international macroeconomies, foreign reserve composition, as well as capital inflows and global imbalances, among other important topics for macroeconomy and financial stability. The main purpose of FLAR is to contribute to the well-being of Latin American and the Caribbean people by promoting the region's macroeconomy and financial stability. That's why FLAR promotes dialogues like this about topics of interest for regional policymakers, especially from Latin America, and academics. It has been a pleasure for FLAR to play a part in collaborating with this research study on the factors that govern the choice of the current composition of official exchange reserves. Probably all of you, or most of you, clearly know the bios of Professor Ito and Professor McCauley. However, I want to mention some specific points about them. Hiro Ito is Professor of Economics at Portland State University, Oregon, United States of America. He has focused on his work on fields on financial liberalization and development, capital flows, emerging market open macro policies, and global imbalances. He is currently an associate editor of the Journal on International Money and Finance and the Journal of International Commerce, Economics and Policy. Professor Ito received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and his Master of Arts in International Relations from the Paul Nitz School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. He also holds a BA in law from Waseda University. From the other side, Robert McCauley does policy relevant and market-savvy research on international financial markets, the international monetary system, and corporate finance. Professor McCauley combines deep analysis with broad communication, especially in media as Financial Times, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and New York Times extensively quote his work. He has enjoyed teaching courses on banking and international finance in business and law schools. Bob was economist at the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in its monetary and economic department. Until his retirement in this year, he represented this department in the Markets Committee and bi-monthly meeting, and he belongs to the bi-monthly meeting that brings together heads of the market operations from major central banks. He coordinated the department contribution to senior management speeches. In his night job, he research span the international monetary system, reserve management, foreign exchange markets, and renminbi internationalization. Bob serves on the scientific committee on the Fondation Banque de France. So I am accompanied by Camilo Contreras, our senior economist of FLAR Economic Studies Department. The webinar's format is as follows. First, we will begin with Hiro Ito and Robert McCauley presentation, lasting about 40 minutes. After this presentation, we will have 20 minutes to discuss and address questions and comments from the audience. So it's my pleasure to begin. Yield the floor to Professor Hiro Ito and Robert McCauley. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and good morning, everybody. This is Hiro Ito from Portland State University, and I'm very much honored to be here. It's quite exciting to have this online presentation, which is my first time. So I'd like to thank FLAR for organizing this event, and more importantly, I'd like to thank FLAR for giving us some help to get the data for this study. And as you'll see later, this study hadn't been done without the help of FLAR. So FLAR allowed us to use very important data for this study, and they asked other central banks to allow us to use the data. So Bob and I very much thank you for the data. So let me start my presentation. As the title says, it's about the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves. And for the last 10 years or so, academia and policymakers have been discussing a lot about the issue of international currency. And that's mainly because we have went through several world economic events that really raised the question of what constitutes for international currency. If you think about great financial crisis or global financial crisis of 2008, some people argue that the dollar unipolar system may have contributed by allowing the US to borrow with relative ease from the rest of the world, and that may fueled US profligacy. And also, even after the global financial crisis, as I'll show you in a minute, the dollar dominance seems to even have strengthened in the aftermath of global financial crisis. Then once advanced economies slow down, many of them or most of them implemented extremely lax monetary policy. And in such ultra low interest rate environment, emerging market economies increased exposure to the dollar. So in that sense also, the dollar dominance even strengthened in very recent years. Then it's not just about the US dollar, but also other currencies, especially the Chinese currency, renminbi or yuan, stirred the discussion about international currency, especially when the renminbi became one of the SDR composite currencies in 2015. So there's a lot of issues related to international currency. And as I keep saying, that is mainly because the dollar continues to dominate the international monetary system. Then this is kind of interesting because if you look at the US economy in terms of the size of GDP or in terms of the volume of trade, which you can see at the bottom of the slide, the US economy has been in a declining trend, again, in terms of GDP or in terms of international trade. But when it comes to the share of the dollar, which we can also see in this slide, the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves has been stable. And also the size or the share of the dollar weight or dollar zone, which I'll explain later, the share of the dollar zone in the world has been quite stable. And as far as the most recent years are concerned, the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves or the dollar share in the dollar share in the in terms of the dollar zone, both of them have been even increasing in most recent years. So that is quite interesting. And so that's the kind of issues we focus in this paper. But when you think about the role of international currency, you may have encountered this kind of table that shows different roles of money, then either by the government sector or by the private sector. Then international reserves holding is quite important because the government sector sees that as the way or means to store value of financial assets. And that is what we focus in this paper. And the reason why we focus in this paper is that there are not so many studies done focusing on this issue. There are many studies that look into the determinants of the level of international reserves. But when it comes to the currency composition of international reserves, there are not so many. And the reason why is because the data are not so much available. So this table is about the same as the previous one, but that shows the data sources for different roles of international currency. But when you focus on international reserves holding or foreign exchange reserves, then the data are not so much available for individual countries. So what we do in this paper is that we introduce a new data set on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves for about 60 economies in the last 2 decades. Then we show how the shares of the US dollar and the euro are related to currency zone weights and the currency denomination of international trade and stocks of external debt. Then we also try to see if including other variables affects the share of these major currencies. Then what we find here is that the economies which try to stabilize their currencies movements against key currencies tend to hold more reserve assets denominated in those key currencies. So if a country tries to stabilize its currency movement against the US dollar, then such an economy tends to hold reserve assets more denominated in the US dollar. Then if an economy of concern denominates its international trade or exports in this case in the dollar, then such an economy tends to have more dollar share in foreign exchange reserves. And this kind of positive relationship also holds for the dollar share of cross-border debt stocks. Then including other variables as robustness checks doesn't seem to change the baseline results. And in terms of robustness checks, we also find that greater openness of the domestic financial markets tend to lead to a smaller share of US dollars in its foreign exchange reserves. So these are the findings of this study. Then let me start explaining our innovative data set on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves. Well, we all know that foreign exchange reserves play an important role as an official store of values. And that means that, foreign exchange reserves reflect the conditions of monetary and trade policies. But when it comes to the currency composition of individual currencies for individual countries, the data is not publicly available. So when you think about currency composition of foreign exchange reserves, you may think about COFOR database. COFOR stands for Currency Composition of Official Foreign Exchange Reserves. This data set is publicly available, but only for the entire world, the group of advanced economies and the group of emerging market economies, not for individual countries. Then in the past, there are some studies that look into the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves of individual countries, but those studies are usually have been done by economists affiliated with the IMF. So you see some old papers from the 1970s and 80s. These are all done by IMF economists. So what we've decided to do is that, okay, if the data are not so much available, why don't we just dig them by ourselves? So we have gone through annual reports, financial statements, and other relevant materials of the central banks across the world and manually collected data on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves of individual countries. Then, as for the data for Latin American economies, as I said, FLAR really helped us to collect the data for Latin American economies. There are 9 or 10 of them whose data we have now. Thank you very much, FLAR. So now our data set includes 58 economies that includes 13 advanced economies and 45 emerging market economies. And for our database, we intentionally exclude the issuers of the key international currencies, such as the US, the Euro member countries, and Japan. The reason why is because we really just wanted to focus on the economies that hold key currency denominated assets as foreign reserves. So Japan, for example, and holds yen denominated assets, but yen is one of the key currencies, key international currencies. So we decided not to include Japan in our data set and so forth. So as a result, our data set turns out to be relatively comprehensive, more comprehensive than other studies that use relatively smaller data sets and country coverage. But at the same time, our data set is still not as comprehensive as some of the papers in the past. Those are the ones published in 1970s and 80s and so forth. But our cutting edge is that we cover more recent years, that is from 1999 through 2017. So I think this is one of the biggest contributions of this paper to the literature. So what is the country average of our data set? Well, if we think about the country coverage of our data in terms of world GDP, our data set accounts for about 51% of world GDP. I mean, our data set has the data for the countries that account for 51% of the world GDP. And in terms of world international reserves, our data set accounts for about 63%. But as I said, we decided to exclude the key currency issuers. So once we exclude the GDP or international reserves of these key currency issuers, then our coverage goes up to 75% in terms of world GDP or 74% in terms of international reserves. Then our data set includes China, but we have only 2 observations for China, one in 1996 and the other in 2014. They disclosed these figures quite recently. Then, as we all know, China accounts a large share of world GDP and also a large share of world international reserves. So once we exclude China, then our coverage is pretty good. We cover about 2/3 of the world GDP and also another 2/3 of international reserves in terms of the countries included in our data set. So I think we have done a fine job to try to cover as many economies as possible. So how does our data set look, especially compared to the IMF's COFAR database? We have 2 panels of figures. The one on our right shows the shares of US dollars, euro, and Japanese yen, and British pound using a COFAR database. And the panel on our left shows the same currency shares, but using our data set. And what we see here is that the dollar share in our data set is much smaller, and the euro share is much higher. And the reason why we observe this is mainly because we have a lot of Eastern European countries, and also we have non-Euro European countries. And that is the reason why the dollar share tends to be smaller and the euro share tends to be higher. But what's interesting here is that if you look at the time period after 2013 or so, we see kind of bump for the dollar share, whether you use our data set or the IMF COFAR data set. So, and also if you look at the kind of rough characteristics of over time development of the shares, these 2 data sets yield sort of a similar results. Okay, what about, okay, let's focus on our database. Then these panels of figures show the shares of US dollars and the euro, but we group countries depending upon whether they're advanced economies or emerging market economies or non-emerging market developing countries. The definition is based on the IMF's definition. And what we see here is that, not surprisingly, advanced economies tend to have high euro share in foreign exchange reserves. Then emerging market economies tend to have higher dollar shares in their foreign exchange reserves. In this slide, we look at the shares of the dollar and the euro, but by the region, by the regional groups. And not surprisingly, we have the highest dollar share throughout the sample period for West Hemisphere countries, i.e. Canada and Latin American countries. So Latin American countries tend to have high dollar share, and they also tend to have low euro share. Then Latin American countries are followed by African countries and Asian economies. And those three groups of countries tend to have low euro shares, which is not very surprising. So now we have just seen the summary statistics of the data we have in our new data set. Then let's take a look at the correlations among different aspects of currency. We macroeconomists think that different roles of money reinforce the use of each other. So, for example, monetary authorities, if they try to anchor their domestic currency to key currency, then they tend to hold more reserves assets denominated in that key currency. Or if the economy of your concern conducts international trade with its large portion denominated in the key currency, then its foreign exchange reserves tend to be more denominated in that currency. Then if a large part of an economy's bank and bond debt is denominated in a key currency, then countries try to match cash flows by holding foreign exchange reserves denominated in that key currency. So, we look at the table of different roles of money, then we think that those different roles of money tend to reinforce each other. So that leads us to think about, okay, why don't we just take a look at the correlations of different roles of money? Then we focus on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves, and we think of that as a function of currency weights. Currency weights here, we mean that to which currency or against which country, against which currency, a country tries to stabilize its domestic currency. Then we also think about currency denomination of international trade and currency of denomination for debt stocks and so forth. So we try to look at the correlations of these different roles of money. And let's start with the currency weights. So currency weights, again, means that to which key currency a country of your concern tries to stabilize its domestic currency against. Then, in other words, by looking at key currencies, you can also think about that as the share of a key currency in terms of its currency zone. So if a country has higher US dollar weights, that means that such a currency, the extent of such a currency belonging to the dollar zone is higher. That's what we think. So if Mexico belongs to the dollar zone, which it does, then the estimation I'm about to talk about can give you some ideas about to what extent Mexico belongs to the dollar zone. So then the extent is what we call currency weights. So for that, we use estimation method popularized by Frankel and Wei. And in this estimation, basically what you do is that you run the regression of the currency depreciation against the dollar on the currency depreciation against the euro and the Japanese yen. Then the estimated weights, the estimated betas can be regarded as the estimated currency weights. Then you have the estimated currency weights for the euro and for the Japanese yen. Then if you subtract them from 1, then you have the estimated weights for the dollar. So obviously, we assume that we are facing an implicit currency basket that is composed of the US dollar, the euro, and Japanese yen. And we estimate these betas. And because we estimate the betas in a rolling window fashion, meaning with the rolling windows of 36 months for the period from 1999 to 2017, in our estimation, these estimated betas are time varying. So we know the time varying weights of the major currencies. Then that means we have the time varying extent of a currency belonging to either the dollar zone or the euro zone or the Japanese yen zone. So this is the scatter diagram that shows the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves for the y-axis and the dollar share, the dollar zone share for the x-axis. Then these two variables appear to be positively correlated. So about 55% of the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves, the variation of it can be explained by the extent of belonging to the dollar zone. Then you see some European countries on your left and some other African and Asian countries on your right. So those countries, for European countries, if the extent of belonging to the dollar zone is smaller, then they tend to hold fewer reserves denominated in the dollar. Then we see some Latin American economies somewhere in between, scattering around. And but overall, we see some positive relationship between the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves and the dollar zone weight. What about the correlation between the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves and currency denomination of international trade? The data on the shares of currencies in international trade or trade invoicing, this is another very restrictive data. It's very hard to find such data, but I have been looking for such data for recent years. Then I have written some papers where I introduce the data set for the shares of key currencies in trade invoicing. And for this study, we update those data sets. And because of the update, now we cover 64 countries. Then for this study particularly, we used the dollar or euro shares in export invoicing. So the panel on your left see the correlation between the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves and the dollar share in export invoicing. Then you see positive relationship with a relatively high magnitude, which is 84%, and the adjusted R-square is relatively high as well. But what we have to notice here is that the sample size is quite small. We only have the data for 17 countries. And this is the reason why there are not so many studies that use the data on the currency shares in trade invoicing. And instead, people tend to use the share of the US as a trading partner. So the figure you see on the right, instead of having the dollar share in trade invoicing, we have the dollar, we have the, sorry, we have the US share in exports for the x-axis. By doing so, we have a much bigger database. Now we have the data for 55 countries. Then, but the problem here is that if you use the US share in international trade instead of the dollar share in trade invoicing, then the correlation gets much weaker. And the reason why this happens is because although many scholars use the US share in international trade as a kind of a substitute for the dollar share in trade invoicing, although that's what people do, but these two variables are not highly correlated. So that means that using the US as the trade partner, you have to be a little bit careful about it. So, but in any case, we still see some positive correlation, but the R squared gets much smaller. So that's what we have. And in the regression results, I'll show you later, we have samples for which we use the dollar share in trade in exports invoicing, and also the US share as the trading partner, because we have to have some robustness checks by having a larger sample. Okay, what about the correlation between the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves and the currency for denomination in debt stocks? We measure the dollar and the euro share of denomination using the weighted average of their shares in international debt securities and in cross-border banks. The currency shares in international debt securities and currency shares in cross-border bank loans, the data are available from the BIS database. And using that, we see the correlation between the shares of the US dollar or the euro in foreign exchange reserves and those currency shares in external debt stocks. Then we see again positive correlation, and the estimated magnitude is quite high, 0.90, and the adjusted R squared is quite high as well, which means that, which is not surprising, because we know once you have a certain currency composition for your liabilities, and you tend to have a similar currency composition for your reserve assets, and that's what we find here. And actually, this estimation shows kind of too strong a fit. So because of that, in the regression analysis I'll show you later, we decided not to include this variable in our regression exercise. So now we have the three variables. One variable is for the dollar or euro shares in exports, and another one is for the dollar or euro shares in foreign exchange reserves. And we have also the estimated currency zone weights for the dollar and the euro. And then these panels of figures show the development of these variables over time. And what we see here is that we have Australia, Bulgaria, Denmark, and Philippines for this slide. And these are sort of representatives of different types of kind of experience over time. If you look at Bulgaria, once Bulgaria became more economically independent from Russia, then their dollar share started declining, and instead the euro share has been on a rise for that country. And if you look at Denmark, you see that Denmark pegs its currency to the euro. So of course the euro share in terms of foreign exchange reserves or in terms of the eurozone weight has been almost one throughout years. And another thing I should remark here is that our data set doesn't have many East Asian economies. The reason why is because East Asian economies tend not to disclose the data on currency composition of foreign exchange reserves. We have Philippines and Sri Lanka, and both countries show a high degree of reliance on the US dollar. Then what about Latin American economies? So these are the figures for relatively large Latin American economies. But before going to Latin American economies, I should also mention that in general, the currency shares in trade tend to be relatively stable. Then the degree of stability is followed by foreign exchange, followed by currency shares in foreign exchange reserves. Then the extent of belonging to a certain currency zone, the currency weights tends to be more variant, and that applies to most of the countries. Then if we look at big Latin American economies, we still see that kind of characteristics. But what's interesting here is that if you look at countries like Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, all of which export a lot of commodities, then their Eurozone weight started rising in the early 2010s, although it came down in more recent years. But the estimated Eurozone weights increased for many exporters of commodities. That applies to Australia as well. But at the same time, the dollar or the euro share in export invoicing has been still very stable, despite the change in the estimated weight of the dollar or the euro. But if you look at smaller Latin American economies, it's very clear that smaller Latin American economies have been very much dependent on the dollar throughout the sample periods. So this is what we have seen so far, and then let's run a simple regression. So the dependent variable is the share of the dollar in reserves. We run this simple OLS regression using unbalanced 3-year non-overlapping panels for the period from 2000 to 2017. Then from columns 1 through 3, we include the explanatory variables by each of them. Then we see that we see high correlation as we saw in terms of simple correlation, but such high estimates of the degree of correlation still holds if you include more than one variables. Okay? So if a country denominates its international trade or its imports in the dollar, then such an economy tends to hold more dollar-denominated reserve assets and so forth. What about the euro share? Same thing. Even if you have the share of the euro as the left-hand side variable, we still see high correlation between the currency shares in reserves and currency shares in export invoicing or the dollar or the euro zone weights. Then even if you include these variables together, still you retain significant estimates. Here, this panel still shows the regressions on the shares of the dollar or the euro in foreign exchange reserves. And we have the same explanatory variables, but what we have here is what we call beta coefficients. So that means that the estimated coefficients in the table show how many standard deviations of the dependent variable would change if you change the explanatory variable by one standard deviation. Then what we can see here is that if you look at column 1, if you increase the dollar share in export invoicing by one standard deviation, then the share of the dollar in foreign exchange reserves would go up by 0.15 standard deviations. But what I'd like to focus here is that the estimated magnitude for the US dollar share in export invoicing and also the USD currency weights, the estimated coefficients are about the same. So which means that both variables, the dollar share in export invoicing, and also the extent of belonging to the dollar zone, they are equally important. And that's something we can see in these figures as well. We picked Israel, South Africa, and China, and then show the contributions of the currency shares in trade invoicing or belonging to the currency zone. Then we are looking at the estimated contributions to the currency shares in foreign exchange reserves. Then for Israel, we do a pretty good job in predicting the shares of the share of the dollar in foreign exchange reserves. And for South Africa, our estimation is much lower than the actual observed US dollar. And for China, we don't have the data for dollar shares in China's trade. So we kind of estimated as a kind of out of sample predictions, and by having two different scenarios. One scenario is, okay, what if the dollar share in China's exports is 85%? Or another scenario is, what if the dollar share in China's exports is 75%? So these are shown with the square or the triangles, but either case, our model predicts much higher dollar share in China's exports. But actual China's dollar share, or the dollar share in China's exports, is much smaller, which is shown with this X. So of course, our predictions can be off for some countries, but overall, our model predicts the dollar or the euro share relatively well. And as you can see in these figures as well, the contributions of the currency shares in international trade or the currency shares in currency zones, and they are equally important. Robustness checks. Well, we have done a very simple exercise, and some people may say, this kind of approach can have some missing variable bias. Okay, so one potential variable that can affect is that, okay, what about the impacts of some financial crisis? So we have the dummies for currency crisis, debt crisis, and banking crisis. Then we throw these dummies into the estimations. First of all, the results of our baseline regression are not affected. So still, the dollar or the euro share in export invoicing, or the dollar or euro share in terms of currency rates, they are equally important. But what's interesting here is that the estimates for currency share or currency crisis or debt crisis, they have the positive, significantly positive estimates for the dollar share. But the dummy for the banking crisis is significantly negative. So that means that if a country experiences either currency crisis or debt crisis, then such an economy tends to increase the dollar share in its foreign exchange reserves. But interestingly, the estimated estimate for banking crisis has a negative variable. But we think that that's mainly because we have a lot of European countries in our data set. Then when European countries experience banking crisis, and they, especially in our time period, in our sample period, those economies tended to want to hold more euro-denominated reserves to fight banking crisis. So that's what we find. What about including a variable for exchange turnover? We have the data for the dollar share in turnover, total turnover from the BIS database, then we find positive correlation, as you can see in this scatter diagram. Then when we run the regression, yes, the share of the dollar or the euro in terms of the exchange turnover, they have significantly positive estimates. Then including this variable doesn't affect the estimates of the baseline regressions. And we also test other variables such as the total size of foreign exchange reserves, because some people argue that if you have a larger volume of foreign reserves, then you may be able to diversify your reserve portfolio. So in that case, you may decrease the dollar share in your foreign exchange reserves. But what we see here is that in columns 1 and 2, we don't find any evidence for such an argument. Then we included interest rates differentials and also the rate of depreciation. We do find some effect coming from the rate of depreciation, but the impact seems to be limited. And also including these variables doesn't really affect the main line regressions. And what about financial development? Well, if a country has relatively less developed financial markets, then such a kind of starter country may tend to hold more dollar assets. Then in that case, the estimated coefficient for the financial development variable can be negative for the dollar share, which we do not find. More financially open economies may tend to be able to diversify their reserve portfolio. In that case, the estimate of financial openness can be negative on the dollar share, which we find. So if a country has more open financial markets and such an economy tends to hold smaller share of the dollar in its foreign reserves. Then if you run the same regression for the euro share, we find significantly positive results. So which means that while decreasing the dollar share in foreign exchange reserves, countries with more financially open or more open financial markets, they tend to increase the share of the euro in their reserve assets. So these are the main findings. So again, we look at the correlations of different roles of international money, and we found that first of all, if a country tries to stabilize its domestic currency movement against a certain major currency, then such an economy tends to have a higher share of that currency in its foreign exchange reserves. Which kind of makes sense, because if a currency varies less against the dollar or than against other major currencies, for example, then a reserve portfolio with a substantial dollar share poses less risk when returns are measured in domestic currency. Then if a country denominates its international trade or exports in our case, then such an economy tends to have a higher share for the dollar in its foreign exchange reserves as well. And such a positive correlation was found also for the external debt, or the currency composition of external debt stocks. Then lastly, if a country has a more financially open or more open financial markets, and such a country tends to diversify its portfolio, reserve portfolio, meaning lower dollar shares and higher euro shares in its reserve assets. So that's what we have found, and we are very much open to questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ito, for the clear presentation. Now we have time for some audience questions. Camilo and I will convey these questions. Now we have a first one here is regarding maybe as I understand the inertial component in some countries. It is the following. Several countries may maintain a large part of their reserves in US dollars because it has been the tradition in their economies, and they do not want to explore other currencies of which they are not familiar with. How this inertial factor could be captured by your methodology?
Okay. Should I answer that question now, or?
Maybe we can do other two questions. Camilo has another one. And then...
So the first question is, if I rephrase it, can there be any kind of regional impact on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves?
As I understand, it's something that is inertial. For example, in our region, some countries have the tradition to use US dollars as the main currency. Right. So they don't want to explore any other currency, maybe for idiosyncratic factors, or maybe there is inertia in the international, in the foreign exchange management. Right. So how could this factor could be included in the methodology? How is this factor included in the methodology? This is the question. And maybe this is related to your comments about the behavior of the shares in the US dollars and the euros in the Latin American smaller countries, or maybe we can have establish a comparison with the biggest countries in the region. I don't know. This is the background. Okay. And Camilo has other question from the audience.
Okay. Professor Ito, given that Latin America is primarily a commodity-driven region and China's growing role in international trade, do you think that can be a change in reserve composition in Latin America in the future in favor of renminbi?
Okay.
Excuse me, Professor Ito. As I understand, Robert is asking for doing some comments too. I don't know. Maybe.
So maybe let me answer these two questions first, if it's okay. Yeah. Okay. About the inertia, yes, it is usually the case, and many people argue, such as the paper by Chin and Frankel, they see that the use of certain international currency, the development can be following the non-linear process. So maybe there can be some kind of tipping point where the use of a certain currency goes up suddenly. So until that tipping point, the use of that currency can be quite stable. So in terms of estimation methodology, yes, I think one thing we can do is to use a model like GMM by including a lagged variable of the dependent variable. Then so that you can capture the extent of inertia in terms of the use of a certain currency for reserves holding. Then in this paper, in the appendix, we show the estimation results from the estimation with the GMM model. Then we do find that inertia is quite strong. So I think the extent of inertia is somewhere around 80 to almost 90% or so. So that means that if you include a year lagged variable as one of the explanatory variables, then that tends to capture a lot of the movement in the following year. Then it can even observe some of the estimates of other explanatory variables. So inertia is quite strong. And it's not just about reserved assets. I have some other papers where I show the inertia is quite strong in terms of the currency composition of exports and imports as well. So inertia is strong. But when it comes to, again, the estimation methodology, GMM results can be or should be taken with some grain of salt. Because the time duration is short, and at the same time, the coverage of the countries tends to be a little bit small, especially if you include a variable for trade invoicing. So in that case, the estimation results can be a little bit kind of fuzzy. Then it can change drastically if you change the country composition in the estimation. And another question about China's trade. Yes, the use of Chinese yuan as the reserve currency at this point is very, very small. Then it can be higher, but at this point, I think we tend to have a consensus that we don't see any renminbi currency zone. So what we find in our study is that the extent of belonging to a currency zone is quite important. So that means if China really wants to increase the use of renminbi as the reserve currency, then there has to be a relatively large renminbi currency zone, which we don't observe. But this question can be related to the question of nonlinear development of the currency use. So at this point, except for countries like Malaysia or some other Southeast Asian countries, the use of renminbi is not so big in terms of foreign exchange reserves or in terms of trade invoicing and so forth. But here comes the nonlinear story, because once certain countries pass the tipping point, then there can be some kind of a cascade change in the size of the renminbi zone. Then once the renminbi zone gets big enough, then that can impact the currency, the renminbi share in foreign exchange reserves. So that may happen. So in the near future, we may see a higher share for the renminbi in reserved assets, but we are not at the tipping point yet.
May I?
Thank you, Professor. Robert is asking.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, FLAR, for all your contribution to this research effort. On the force of inertia, I think sometimes it's a matter of the reporting currency. So if reserves are by law, central bank law, or by habit reported in dollars, it can be difficult to move away from the dollar just because that is bound to introduce extra variation in the reported reserves and perhaps lead to questions in the event that the dollar is appreciating. So I think it was the Central Bank of Chile some years ago started to think of their reserves in terms of a basket of major currencies, and they reported the reserve levels in that basket, not because they were required to by law, but because it was consistent with the way they were thinking about it and analyzing the problem. But another force that could make for inertia is the observation that Hiro already made, which is that the export invoicing tends to be very consistent. So for commodity currencies, it tends to be consistently high in dollar terms. So even if the Frankel-Way style analysis shows that commodity currencies have in recent years shown a strong echo of the euro's movement against the dollars, if policymakers are looking at the composition of the major currencies in the export invoicing, they're going to see nothing but a consistent dollar dominance. And so it requires more analysis, and the influence of the euro and perhaps also now the RMB is less obvious than it can be in trade invoicing. I think that there are times the RMB's influence on neighboring currencies and on commodity currencies is something that seems to come and go depending on the policy that the People's Bank of China is following in the management of the RMB. But there are certainly times when there is a quite discernible RMB zone. And the logic of our argument is that if currencies are moving with the RMB, even if imports or exports are not invoiced in the RMB, central banks will find it convenient to invest more of their reserves in the RMB. It's not necessarily that a commodity exporting country is trying to stabilize its currency against the RMB. It could just be that the China is the major demand for the commodities, and so the variations in China's macroeconomy that show up in the RMB's exchange rate also naturally show up in the exchange rate of trading partners in the commodity business. So that's what I had to say.
Thank you, Robert.
Sorry, Professor Ito, could you stop sharing the presentation so people can see you while you are answering our questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we have the following comment and question.
Click
about,
the little button, Hiro.
Excuse me, Robert.
You
Yes.
want to click the middle button. No, not change the page. You want to get rid of the.
What do you see here?
Parece que ya.
Yes, it is okay, I think.
No.
No?
Can you see the slide now?
Yes, we are seeing the slide. Maybe you can minimize the. Okay, we are continuing with the following question meanwhile.
Stop sharing the screen.
Sharing the screen, I thought I did. So when I was talking, nobody could see the slides?
No, they could see them, Hiro. Now we want to get rid of them. So I think you have to hit the middle button, the sort of upload button.
Yes, maybe. Okay, let's continue with the following comment. Latin America has a vast history of partial and full dollarization in its economies. How do you believe your analysis could change in the case of partially dollarized economies? Of course, this is about the future. Maybe we had a great history of high inflation in some countries, instability, and maybe they explain the level of dollarization in some countries. So how do you think this analysis could have new elements in our region regarding the dollarization aspects?
Bob, you want to take this
Yeah,
question?
I would interpret dollarization at this stage as a missing variable in our analysis, that the domestic money and debt stocks denominated in dollars would be an additional reason to hold dollars. So I think particularly for dollarized economies and your euroized economies in Eastern Europe, we may be pinning explanatory strength on variables that are correlated with the dollarization or the euroization. So I think that's an important next step, because a central bank that has a banking system that's got lots of dollar deposits will have to wonder about runs on its banks in the domestic context in US dollars, and would naturally think of holding more dollars in reserves just to perform the lender of last resort function in the domestic context, given the multi-currency banking system.
And I think in the near future, if Latin American economies face some kind of macroeconomic instability, then that would only strengthen the reliance on the dollar. So in our study, we found that countries with relatively high level of inflation tend to have a larger dollar share in its foreign exchange reserves. And so that means, macroeconomic disturbances or instability can strengthen the extent of dollarization or the reliance on the dollar.
Thank you, professors.
Professor, according to the results of your research and the roles that play an international currency, what do you think about the role of special drawing rights, SDRs, as relevant international currency?
I think, the role of SDR, I'd say it's quite important as it has been. So I think one way China may be thinking about is that, okay, the world is so much dominated by the dollar. So that means one country's policy can affect the whole world economy. So that kind of extensive reliances may not be causing stability in the world economy. So in such a case, some kind of currency with much weaker dollar color can be a good international currency. So maybe China, maybe that's one of the motives for China to make its currency become international currency. But the UN zone does not happen in the very near future yet. So that means that the composite currency such as SDR is quite important. And so in that sense, the inclusion of renminbi as the composite currencies in 2015, 2016 is a very important step forward.
May I? I respectfully disagree with Hiro. I think the scope for use of the SDR in international lending markets, in international bond markets, as a separate standalone investment in foreign exchange reserves as a way of denominating exports and imports. I think the prospects for all of those are very, very low, because the example of the ECU in Europe, which benefited from a great push, the Italian and French governments issuing debt in ECU, the BIS running a clearing mechanism for private ECUs, even with a great deal of public sector support, the ECU never really got off the ground until it was clear that it was going to become the euro. So I think markets don't really like composites. They can roll their own and optimize. They don't need a basket that is decided and changed every 5 years by some folks in Washington. So I think most proposals that involve the SDR either make sense or don't make sense quite independently of the role of the SDR in the proposal. But that's obviously a very personal view.
Markets don't like composite currency, but policymakers tend to like. And I think the policymakers in East Asia, for example, they've been thinking about introducing AKI for many, many years. And of course, as Bob says, it's not very much welcomed by the markets. But the policymakers, I think they see the sort of the risk or the danger of relying on the dollar as this kind of solo, the dominant currency. The risk is can be a little bit too high. So to mitigate the risk, some composite currency may play a role. But at the same time, because it's not so much welcomed by the market, so what can push that forward can be politics or some kind of international relations.
May I, if you replay 2008 when the Fed was offering dollars through swaps, and you have a world in which international banking is done in SDRs rather than dollars, you would not only need the Federal Reserve to decide to do the right thing at the right time with the right counterparties, but you would need 4 other central banks or fiscal authorities to do the same right thing at the same right time and with the same counterparties. It seems to me a world financial system based on the SDR, when you think about that, is not obviously more stable than one that is more dominant on a single, more reliant on a single currency rather.
I think the network effect is so high. So that really strengthens the reliance on the dollar. So, again, this is a non-linear issue, right? So the equilibrium at this point is not in favor of the SDR, but in favor of the dollar. So if there's a really strong push for some composite currency, it may happen, but you know, I don't know if I'm that optimistic or not either, to be honest.
Thank you for your interesting comments. And we have time for one last question that Camilo has from the audience.
Okay, Professor and Robert, does the profitability play any role in currency composition?
Yes, Bob, you'd be.
I think all previous studies that have tried to find a rate of return effect on the choice of currencies in foreign exchange reserves have failed. Nevertheless, I think that part of the reason why the euro has lost market share, not over the past 2 years, but I think why the euro has lost market share over the last 5 years is that, you know, if you're going to buy German or French government bonds, you're lucky if you get a zero interest rate, and you may well have to pay up year by year. And I think reserve managers have as one of their priorities the preservation of capital, and negative interest rates weigh strongly against the instinct of a reserve manager to preserve his capital. So it's hard to tell, because there was also a European debt crisis that led to that came before the negative interest rate. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going on there, but certainly negative returns have not helped the euro attract more investment from reserve managers in the Western Hemisphere or elsewhere.
Thank you, Robert. Hiro, do you have any comment or? Okay.
I want to reemphasize
Yes.
Our appreciation of your collaboration and help for the data. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And also, I hope that we're going to continue working together.
Yes, yes. We would like to thank to you, Professor Ito, and Professor McCauley, for your participation to share with us these interesting results from your research project. We also thank to all the central bank officials, ministries of finance, the World Bank, scholars, and the wide variety of participants on this webinar. It was a very fruitful dialogue. We will continue collaborating with Robert and Ito in future projects. And now we have some points that discovered during this discussion that we will continue, or will be very interesting to continue collaborating and analyzing. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.